Hey there, welcome to the Quantum Leap podcast. Today we've got a special feature for you. We're going to be taking a look at how an episode of Quantum Leap gets made from start to finish. Usually what we do for our interviews is pull out certain scenes or ask actors how they got involved in the business, things like that. But today we're going to be getting an end-to-end view. And to give us this insight is none other than showrunner and executive producer Dean Georgaris. Dean, welcome back to the show. Thank you for coming back.
How are you?
Yeah, very good.
I noticed your crew jacket.
Yes. I wasn't sure if you'd be wearing yours. I thought it might be a clash, but I thought I'd take the risk.
I know better now. I'll never wear it. Yeah. Whenever we do a Zoom, I'm going to stay away.
Good call. And yeah, we're currently a few episodes away from the end of the season, so I'm like with most of the audience, just watching with excitement. We've just seen Ben's Song for the Defense, so we've got 3 more episodes to go. It's all building up. No idea what's going on with Martinez or Janice, and in a few weeks' time, I guess all will be revealed. Before we get going on just talking about SOS, right now, am I right in thinking you're early in filming season 2?
Very early in filming season 2, yeah. A little later in writing it, you write ahead. But yes, we are filming season 2.
Amazing. That is so exciting. Just knowing that is so exciting. Is there anything that you can tell us about what's going on there? Early days, I know. No spoilers, but...
what I'll share is I think the cast, the crew, all of us are really excited about season 2, and I think that's a good feeling. I know I mentioned earlier on your podcast that we want to take big swings on the show, and it was just, I think I said that to you before we had necessarily taken the cast through everything we were thinking for season 2, and now the cast knows, and to see their excitement is, that makes it all worthwhile, because they're such a talented cast that, you want to give them as much to do as possible. You know what I mean? So I'm excited. But unfortunately, you're going to have to wait a long time.
Yes. Well, that is the frustrating thing with you getting going so early. It's going to be months before we get to see it. But, yeah, I mean, so many shows take that step up in confidence in the second season that it's just, we're really looking forward to seeing what that looks like. But I know that's not what we're here to talk about today. We'll talk loads about season 2 in a few months. Let's just start, maybe, if you could take me back. I always used to have this really naive view, and I know now how naive it is, but perhaps you can just clarify it. I used to think that before a season started, everyone would get together in the writer's room. You'd have, in Quantum Leap's case, 18 amazing ideas, write them down on little cards and say, right, here's our 18 one-line synopses. Now we start writing before anything even starts getting shot. How untrue is that? At what point did SOS come to pass, and how?
I should say, that's not always untrue. On the streaming platforms, they oftentimes will write an entire season before, and then they'll film the entire season. But that's partially because they don't have a schedule that they actually have to keep. Like NBC needs to put something on at 10 o'clock after The Voice in September. So in our case, and in this case it was a little unusual because we had the showrunner change. So when I came on sort of in the middle of shooting the second episode, we were kind of only writing the third episode. We were a little behind. And so, ideally you want to be somewhere around 6 to 7 episodes ahead of the episodes you're filming. And that's because in general, it takes you 8 working days to film an episode. And it takes you more than 8 working days to think of an episode out loud. So what you have to do is first you write what's called a story area, which is about a 1-page document that you share with the network in the studio that says, so for 114, the story area was basically like, we're on a battleship and there's a captain and there's Addison's father is going to be the executive officer, and in this leap year, this is going to happen. Like, just really, like, almost like a summary. And this allows them to sort of flag anything that's like a no starter for them. And you never know what that is. Like sometimes it's, I worked on a show once where we had a fairly geopolitical episode, which was completely fine, and then a geopolitical event erupted like right in that area, and all of a sudden you have to change it. Anyway, so that you write that, then you write an outline that everybody sees, and then you write the episode. So in general, that takes, let's say, 10 to 14 working days. And the reason I'm telling you all this is if you think, okay, 8 working days to film, but 14 working days to write, you can see that what happens is you start with a lead, and then as the season goes on, like the production is catching up. Or if you're lucky and the writer's room's moving fast, you can actually stretch it out. So we sort of started very close together. By the time we got to episode 14, so the idea for episode 14 actually came from an executive producer, writer named Alex Berger, who joined our writing staff after right around September, October, sort of right once we'd kind of gotten production. Everything was running smoothly, but we knew we were short in the writer's room just in terms of the number of people there. Because, again, I think this episode is kind of to take everyone behind the scenes. So a writer covers their own episode through pre-production to editing, right? So it means once you have a writer, you have one writer writing an outline, while one writer's writing a script, while one writer's writing on set, and one is in potentially post-production. So that means at any given time, your writer's room of 8 people, 4 of them are out. So, and depending on, things that can happen, we had a couple of days there where it was only about two people. So Alex Berger had worked with Martin before on Blind Spot, and Alex and I had known each other. And he's a terrific at what's called running the room. I mean, he's terrific at a lot of things. Running the room is just sort of, what's the next idea? How do we figure it out? And when he first came on board, he brought with him this little piece of knowledge that I don't think Martin or I had, which was that the USS Iowa, magnificent World War II battleship, is anchored 35 minutes south of where we film. So he came with the idea we should do a episode aboard the battleship. And so that's literally where it started. And then in this...
And I've got to say, I love that, and that is so... I don't know how normal that is for Hollywood generally, but that is definitely so original Quantum Leap. Like, just finding, there's something there we can use. Let's build a story around that.
One of the things we've learned to do as the show's gone on is look for interesting worlds that we can enter that will feel immersive, but that are conducive to actually being filmed in time. And so that's why Ben's song for the defense, 15 takes place in basically it's a day in the life of a public defender. 16. Just to tease it, will take place in a mental institution. All of this just from research on interesting worlds that we happen to be able to film in fun ways. So, but to get back to your, not even question, but sort of the intro, we, as a room, we got to the battleship episode, and we had known for a long time we wanted to do an episode where we were going to leap into the life of Addison's father. We had talked about, Ben has a little bit of a historical kiss with his mom early in terms of the phone. Addison, by the nature of her character, by being the hologram, I think in some ways is the character whose personal life and personal story we knew the least about, it felt. And certainly given how significant she is, on the show. And so we had targeted, like literally all these different things up on these giant in this case, virtual bulletin boards, because we work in Zoom. And like you sort of were like, Addison's dad. Well, that would make sense because we think he's military, so let's put him on the battleship episode. So we started putting the pieces together and had a general idea that we would want to make it feel like Hunt for Red October or Crimson Tide. We would want it to be an exciting episode with danger and stakes. And right around then, I decided it would probably be fastest because everything we do as a writer's room is about efficiency, with the goal being the best episode. By the time it reaches the screen, it's the best episode. Whether it took a torturous route to get there or an easy route, it doesn't matter. As long as by the time it gets to the screen, it's good. And in this case, because the demands of figuring out the story and matching it to being able to film it, there was actually going to be a lot of the kind of thinking that you would had to have made a lot of movies or TV shows to sort of know all the little tricks you could do. And I'll go into that more in a second. It just made sense for me to write it. Normally as showrunners, I think Martin and I both tend to, our job is to make sure the script, by the time, again, the episode reaches TV, like we feel good about it. Most of the time that's, the writing staff takes care of it. Sometimes, for whatever reason, cast changing or set things, like we might have to do a little rewriting. Like, you don't generally want to write one, not because it's creatively, it's very satisfying. It just takes you, remember I said, like, you're out of the writer's room. It sort of took me off the board in a way for a few weeks. When we film an episode of Quantum Leap, in general, we have 8 days. Sometimes we have 7 days. Like in rare occasion, like a season premiere, we might have 9. And each day costs a certain amount of money, right? Like, so we knew we had 8 days, and it's not like you can just say, okay, I'm going to spend all 8 days at a battleship. Like, you actually can only spend so many days away from your home studios, and then a certain number of days on your home studio. And again, that's just simply to balance the checkbook. Like to go to a location, you have to move everybody there. And you have to pay the fees for location and, all sorts of things. So in the case of the battleship, for example, I knew pretty quickly, and just to be clear, the USS Iowa is a museum. It's amazing, but it's a museum. So it's not like we were going to take the battleship and go out to sea. So Chris Grismer, our producing director, and I started talking, and the very first conversation is, okay, what can you film on the battleship? And then what big chunks will be the sets that our amazing art department will build? And then you'll set a lot of action on those sets. So in the case of SOS, both the bridge and the Combat Information Center, so basically the main interiors, that's not on the Iowa. That was 5 days on our sound stages. And so because of all of that and other things, by the time we asked someone who didn't have as much experience to sort of quickly learn all the little tricks, it wasn't efficient. So you took those ideas, and so you had the battleship, you had Addison, you had I guess Leaper X came into this at some point and started forming a script around them. Can you tell me a little bit about the script writing process? Sure. So the first thing that happens is we work on it with the writer's room. And that can take anywhere from a few days to 7 or 8 days if an episode's hard. And, we break them down into acts of story, and each act is, every commercial break is the end of an act. And so it started with all of us, including in the room, trying to come up with some tent post ideas. And at the very beginning, you have nothing. So, for example, you don't have submarine, you just have battleship. And in the case of SOS, we were also going to do something else that I know the original series did a few times, but we hadn't done yet, which was we were going to license film footage. Universal had this film Battleship that they had made, I think in the early 2000s, actually written by two friends of mine, the Hober brothers. And there were some footage in it that was pretty spectacular that did not have actors in it. So we were going to license that. So one of the note cards was, emergency anchor drop, ship stops.
We're all going to die. Just not today.
You know, so you put those up on the board, and to be honest with you, in most cases, if Martin or myself are not writing, the room will break the episode basically scene for scene, and then they'll tell it to Martin and I. Right? It'll be like, and it's like a 40-minute to an hour thing where there's like, then this happens, and this happens, because I was doing it. At a certain point, it just became more efficient to pull it out of the room. And by then, I was working with one of our writers, Drew Lindo, who wrote Fellow Travelers and also wrote Somebody Up There Likes Ben. And he kind of helped me as I came up with more, let's call them sort of linchpin moments. He helped me arrange where they would be. So, for example, I remember very vividly, first, submarine came pretty early because it made sense, battleship against a submarine like that. And then we got a technical advisor, a submarine captain named William Toady, who was the captain aboard the Los Angeles class attack submarine USS Indianapolis. And for those of you who want to know what that kind of submarine is, just watch Hunt for Red October. Scott Glenn is a captain of a USS Los Angeles class attack submarine. So it's really fun for me as a person who likes history. And he started telling me all the things in the basic idea I had wrong. Like, I was like, okay, well, we're going to have a depth charge scene because I love depth charges. And he's like, yeah, they stopped using depth charges in 1960. I was like, okay, that's a problem. And
make it Addison's grandfather. Just shift it back a couple of years.
And by the way, like, of course, you always, we try very hard to be historically accurate to the time, and it's, we don't always do it, but we certainly try hard. Anyway, it's a long, sort of long way of saying, at a certain point, the idea of mines as an explosive device, literally in our script, became clear that I was going to use mines, which was great because I needed a way for the Chinese to look like they were attacking the battleship, but they couldn't actually be attacking the battleship because. And so I thought, okay, I'll have Addison's dad will stop the boat at the end of the fourth act, which is basically the last commercial break, and then save the day, then we'll have the mutiny speech in the fifth. And Drew's like, I don't know, I think like maybe you should do that earlier and then make the end of the fourth act be, well, now we got to go save the sub. So that's an example of sort of how the process of working on a script with a room works, right? Like, I say, I'm going to make the story at 40 minutes, I'm going to be here. And Drew's like, well, what if you were there 30 minutes? And so, you do that for a while.
So just going back to your point about having the I know you've had technical assistance or technical advice throughout the series. How normal is it that something they say actually has an impact on the early writing process? I sort of imagine, I know you had a boxer trainer for episode 3, and I kind of imagine them just rocking up on the set and helping out with some of the practical stuff. Actually being in that early, has that been the norm so far?
No, it hasn't been. I think because the leaps haven't really required it. In this case, I honestly, you never know how much you're going to ask of them until you get into the story. And in my case, Bill and I talked a lot, and there's a lot of his ideas are in SOS, including when the Chinese CEO, former military counterpart of Magic's, for example, is explaining how those Chinese minds got there, like what they were doing. I had gone as far as thinking they had some minds, and the minds broke free. And then Bill was like, well, it could be that they knew we were sailing subs close, and so they set a trap because that was his idea. And one of the jobs of running a show is to take all of the good ideas and put them in the stew. So very unusual to have this much interaction with the technical advisor, but it's the reason the episode, I think, felt as real as it did at least to the people I got emails from.
So you're writing the episode. At what point, how close to the end of having a completely locked down script are you when you start on the real pre-production work? Is it still very
in this case
ethereal?
In this case, no, and especially with an episode like this, because those 8 days that we used to film, it's like a whole Tetris. For those of you who are old enough to know what Tetris is, I don't know what the modern equivalent is. It's a very intricate puzzle to figure out what order to film things, on what days, and that's really the job of the first assistant director on the episode. One of the first things they do is they take the script and they break it down, and they start to figure out how many hours it's going to take to film each big piece, and then they put them together. And then it's things like, for example, our art department was building those 2 sets, and because we're a show in production, it's not like they're sitting around just waiting for a week with nothing to do. So they knew they were going to turn the nuclear reactor from Leap, Die, Repeat, and then tear it apart and turn that into the sets from the ship. And so in order to give them as many days as possible, those days move to the back 8 of your days. And so we shoot on the battleship first. And our director and everyone needs to know exactly what they're filming on that battleship. It's not, you can't go there and be like, hey, this would be fun. You have to know it all ahead of time. That's one of the realities. So the script was finished. The script was actually the actual writing of it was pretty smooth. The planning of it got a little challenging because we were trying to do a lot from a story standpoint, and I think more than we had tried before, without calling attention to any of it. And so what do I mean by that? So we had Addison's dad, so it was really an Addison story, and Ben's function on the Leap was really just going to be help Addison's dad make the right decision and reach his captain, right? That's ultimately, which is, a little unusual to have it be that. We also knew we wanted the present day story to influence the past and to be a mystery. And we wanted what happened in the past to be what was responsible for what was happening to the battleship. And it was juggling a few more chainsaws than usual. But once it was all in outline form, it actually was pretty smooth to write. You discover some things in the writing, and we can talk about those in a bit. But the script was done probably 3-4 weeks before we shot it, and even when we filmed it, and when we got the footage back, we weren't quite sure if we were going to be able to pull it off, just because it required so much of the crew. So I was happy that it all, it's like, whew, okay, that could have been a spectacular failure. But we wanted to see how much we could do we wanted to make. I was like, that's about as big an episode as we can get in terms of scale. So
I want to ask a little bit about the Tetris game that you mentioned that the first AD has to play. So you've got, obviously, you mentioned about the set pieces. You've obviously got the fact that you're going out there to shoot you mentioned, it's a museum, it's a live location. I guess you've also potentially got actors who might be booked for certain days, but then you've got the risk of sickness, ADRs, pickups. I don't know how well those are scheduled or how well you can schedule those in advance. How often is it that those plans end up having to shift?
I would say...
And did that affect SOS particularly?
SOS, we got lucky. We did not have to make any major shifts for anyone getting sick or the weather, by the way. So the weather's, So, for example, we had 3 days on that ship, and on at least every day, we needed to film pieces outside. So if it had decided to pour rain one day, that would have been a reshuffle. You know what I mean? Or if Brandon had gotten sick, that would have been a reshuffle. But we were lucky. We were very lucky because there wasn't much room for reshuffling in our case. You know what I mean? It was kind of a big bet that way. And also things like people don't think about, where's the sun in the sky? So the director of photography, it's not just put a camera for a pretty shot and put a light somewhere. It's, okay, well, let me look at this room. So, for example, the cabin that Addison's father has as a cabin, which was a real cabin on the Iowa. There's really...
Oh, I assume that was a set piece.
No, that was real. That's a good example of, we really could only build 2 sets. So that's why only two scenes written in his cabin. And we filmed those back to back. So it's quite demanding on the actors. That cabin really only looked photographically interesting from one angle. Now, where's the sun in the sky? You have to think about where the sun is in the sky, because for anyone who's ever taken a photograph into the sun before has seen that their friends, you can't see them because the shadow, the director of photography they have to plan all of that. It's really, it's kind of incredible what they do, especially because you only notice it when they get it wrong. So these are jobs where the only time you notice it, I mean, you certainly notice beautiful cinematography, but one of the most important parts of cinematography for a television show, which is knowing where the sun is in the sky, and they have apps for it, so they actually know. And that's all part of the planning. So when the first assistant director first puts together their puzzle, the director and the director of photography will look at it, and then they might say, I really need an afternoon. I see you have that scheduled for the morning. I need that in the afternoon because the sun's going to be here. So, more fun. It's that's why you'll hear us say it's a group effort to make these shows, because it truly is.
Absolutely. So, what else can you tell me about the pre-production side before we move on to the actual the guts of the filming? Because the only thing that I can think of that you definitely haven't touched on yet is the casting part, which I'd be interested in knowing how often writers are involved in that. And I'm assuming as an EP you were anyway.
In every episode, so for every episode, the writer of that episode, Martin, and myself and the director will comment on the cast. We sort of come to a consensus. Every now and then an episode will have a role that we think might be appealing enough to the kind of actor who might normally not drop in for an episode of television. And because it was Addison's dad, and, you know, as I know you interviewed Brandon, like, we all thought that we had a chance at maybe getting a performer like that. And I want to be clear, like, that doesn't mean they're necessarily better. I mean, Brandon was amazing in this episode, but I can think of some terrific guest performances in the first season that by people who maybe weren't household names, that brought people to tears. So, but it's wonderful to get someone like Brandon because, you know, there's a reason Brandon's Brandon. Like, and in this case, I was really looking for someone who would not be the typical tough, grizzled dad you would be expecting. And, you know, Brandon has such a natural authenticity to there's almost a guilelessness to the way he performs on screen. You know, like, I mean, it's not an accident that, you know, that out of all the people in the world they picked to pick Superman, like, as opposed to Batman or Iron Man. You know what I mean? Like, Brandon has these qualities that I thought would make for very interesting, both surprising, given what little we knew about her dad, but also an interesting contrast, frankly, even with the way Caitlin's been playing Addison up to now. She's incredibly warm and incredibly funny, but Addison is also very tough and guarded and has to be. So we were, we sent Brandon the outline because you want to cast them early in case they say no, because the fancy actor sometimes takes a week to decide. And he read the outline, and then he and I had a Zoom, not much different than this one, and he said yes, which was great. And then Alex read for the role of Captain Drake, and I've loved him since he did a run on Burn Notice, which was a show I loved years ago. And that was the other role that was really, I think, going to be important because we were hoping someone who could bring the colors of, okay, I think he's crazy, but I also understand that he could have been an admirable person once. You know what I mean? And so we were very, very fortunate. And then a bunch of the other supporting cast actually had military experience. We tried to cast as many veterans as possible. So by the time we went to film, I think we felt like we had a strong cast. And we've been lucky or I shouldn't say lucky. That's a total disservice to Jennifer Cooper, our casting director, and that team. We have had terrific actors on the show. And that's good fortune, but not an accident.
You mentioned about casting veterans. I can't immediately think of anything that might be comparable so far this season, but is that anything you've tried to do before where you've got background performers that are from the right kind of background?
I don't know as much on this particular show because, honestly, like, so for example, in Somebody Up There Likes Ben, the champ was actually a boxer. So we had some specific instances. I've worked on shows before in the past where anytime you're dealing with the military in particular, I think you always not even just for authenticity, although there's that, but also, there are a number of veteran, very creative people who go into the armed services, and when they come out, it's nice to see them get a chance to demonstrate their creative side. Some of the biggest TV writers in the last 30 years were lawyers who got a chance to be on law shows. David Kelly for LA Law comes to mind. You're always looking for it. But this episode was the first one I can think of where we really leaned in on it. As I think because you talked to her, Jamie, who is a friend of mine, wrote all the music for Fellow Travelers, and worked with Deborah. So we do whatever you can. You try to make yourself use that as when you can have it.
Yeah. Okay,
Yep.
that makes sense. So maybe we could start talking about the filming process. So did you say the first 3 days on the Iowa?
The first 3 days. So the first 3 days were on the Iowa, in San Pedro, and that included things like we flew a drone over it. So like that opening shot of the ship at sea is actually a drone flying over the not at sea ship, and then we put sea around it, and we filmed all of the things that had any scope to them at all. So that's why you saw the real ship. That's why you saw the real guns. We knew, the director and I knew right from the beginning, and it's even in the script, like that we wanted to start on that deck with like a ringing in the ears and like a disorientation. We actually filmed that the last of the 3 days. But like the foot chase, the stuff between Addison and her dad, I shouldn't say between Addison, the stuff where between Ben and Addison's dad that Addison is witness to. And then at night, we filmed the magic Louis stuff. That's actually right next to the ship. The ship was anchored here, or let's say it's here, and like right over here is where Magic and Louis met, and then you see the beautiful bridge of San Pedro and the port behind it. It was a great. That was sort of on our wish list when I first was writing that he meets someone somewhere. I was like, boy, it'd be great to not have to use the back lot for this. And it timed out, when we built the schedule, we asked, is there a way to get a little 3-hour window to film that entire sequence between the two of them was filmed, in probably 3 hours. It was just fairly simple. But had
it's such a beautiful location, and it goes back to a couple of the things we talked about earlier in terms of what you've got the opportunity for, and having that material from Battleship to fit in, having the Iowa itself, and this location to use because it's there, and it turned out so well because it is so nice, and it's great to not see that backlot again. Those of us that are watching closely, you guys do an amazing job of redressing it every week, but it immediately jumped out as something different, which is very special.
And look, invariably, most of the time in your first or second day of filming, there's a scene that you're on set and you say to yourself, okay, this is either going to work, in which case you kind of are like, okay, like you almost, as a showrunner, you're like, almost like, okay, no, what's the next episode, or what do I have to worry about? Or it's not going to work, in which case you have to pivot. And we haven't really had to do that this season. But in this case, for me, it was the scenes where Ben was talking to Addison's father, and Addison was listening. And these were not easy scenes, and you guys commented on it, and I don't think unfairly, like, there's one scene that has a very tricky transition into. It's the second scene. It's the one where he volunteers that his wife doesn't love him anymore. And it kind of, in a way, it comes out of nowhere. In a way, it was meant to come out of nowhere, but not really when you think of it in a bigger context of, okay, I'm probably going to Leavenworth, like my career, like my, this is a life-changing moment. But now that I think about it, the most important life change that I'm not making is actually not on this ship. It's this. But what's always challenging about asking that of a actors, especially on television instead of movies, is you've had commercial breaks, and commercial breaks always sort of reset the audience, and so that's a scene where he says, "My wife doesn't love me anymore," and you really don't make the connection on screen for about 45 seconds to be like, "Oh, I see," and then Ben actually makes it just in case we missed it. But both that scene and the scene before, sitting there on set and watching Caitlin listening to her dad tell the story. Caitlin is a really remarkable actress, and she makes a lot of things look easy that are not easy. This was a chance to let her shine by listening, which is one of the most challenging, one of the most challenging things for an actor to do authentically, and to make it produce the impact that you want. And so I was watching her during the first few takes, and at that point I realized, and I said earlier we were going to do a bunch of things in this episode that we hadn't done before, and in a way that is another one of them, was the storytelling device of a character learning new things about someone they loved as a witness, right? Like that's and trying to do it in a way that didn't feel too cheesy, to be honest with you. You know what I mean? Trying to, so that we didn't end up with, "Oh, he's the man I never knew. If only I'd known." By the way, I love a good "if only I had known." I love those in stories. It didn't feel appropriate in this story. So we filmed that, I believe, on the second day. And that was, the footage was beautiful from the first day, because our producing director, Chris Grismer, who directed Ye of Little Faith, he's just a very, very good filmmaker. So it looked great, but that was sort of the point where I thought, okay, this won't be as cold an episode as it might have been. All right, that was just sort of the fear. In general, my favorite Quantum Leap episodes are episodes like Family Style, or Fellow Travelers, or Somewhere Up Like that. Like, I personally gravitate towards very personal stories. So in a way, this wasn't necessarily exactly the kind of Quantum Leap episode I would think to do, and trying to make sure there was emotion in it was probably my number one thing, frankly. 3 days and then 5 days on stage.
Yeah. And how much? I know I asked you earlier how kind of locked down the script was before you started. Was there much room for manoeuvre during filming in terms of the actors discovering new ways of delivering lines? Many changes made during production.
There's always room in terms of more than happy for them to beat whatever's on the page. Like that's I think unfortunately sometimes comedy and character moments are the things that get cut for time. We can't. I wish we could have turned in a 47-minute episode for you to watch. I know in Family Style, we cut out about 4 minutes of just really funny things Caitlin said and did, which much to Caitlin's consternation, but she's a good sport about it all. She just happens to be very funny. But this was, scripts like these tend to have less improv because technically they're so precise. And what I mean by that is if you go back and watch, you'll see like where the camera is, where the camera's moving, the action, how much is going on. You tend to have a little less room for improv than, say, on something like Family Style or Fellow Travelers even. Those are just two that come to mind.
the reason I was leading with that a little bit is because I noticed in the script it's almost exactly as it is on screen, apart from a few deleted moments, which we'll come on to when we talk about editing. But the one of my favourite lines of the episode was not in the script.
If I asked you a really dumb question, would that distract you?
Was that a Ray
No,
Lee?
no. So actually, it's funny you say that. That was, we were there, we were filming it, and I don't remember what was in the script, but we all felt like, well, we know we can beat that. Like, there are certain moments or lines where you say to yourself, I'm not going to spend an hour coming up with funny lines right now at 3 a.m. as I try to write this, because I don't have any funny lines in my head. So I'm going to put one down, and then I'm going to remember to do a better job. And in that case, we had a fine one, but I never remembered to do a better job. And when we got to filming it, Chris Grismer, the director, sort of looked at me and said, we should do some alts. We should, like, what else would we do? And I'm trying to remember what the other ones were. But it popped into my head, like, he might as well just say, if I say something really stupid, would it distract you? Because, you know, this episode wasn't as funny as a lot of our episodes, which, again, it's tough because my last show was Baker and the Beauty. Like, I like humor a lot. And so any chance to put a little humor in this, we jumped at. But also, and by the way, that was Chris, myself, Raymond, Heather, our script supervisor. We were just standing there pitching lines. Basically, like, it was just a fun. But when we landed on that one, we knew, especially the way Ray, his facility for delivering comedy, it just felt like it was going to be a good moment. I think another one was basically, like, if I told you I was a time traveler with a distraction. You know, we came up with all of these things he could say.
Yeah, Raymond does have this very offhand way of delivering those kind of lines, which just, it works so well.
But I will say this, every episode of Quantum Leap resembles the script closely. Like, that's part of television. This kind of television is your job, the writer's room's job, is to deliver the words and the settings and the people as close to polished as possible. And then on the day, sometimes you find things, but more often than not, and this sort of is a segue, more often than not, how can I put this? So we've got our 8 days, right? And we've got our Tetris board. And so let's say we're filming in the headquarters. And the scene has Nanrissa and Ernie talking. And the last 2 or 3 lines of the scene are information. In your mind, you're like, I don't think we really need this. I don't think we really need this. There's no reason not to film it. Do you know what I mean? Like, in other words, you've got 2 great actors. No reason to stop them after 7 lines. It literally takes 10 more seconds to get those 3 more lines.
How's it looking?
Remember before when we were worried that at the end of the sleep, Addison might have changed? Well, it feels like the changes could be a bit more, global.
I don't believe the leaps are random. I don't believe it's all just a roll of the dice.
If you don't have them and you need them, then you have to do what's called ADR, additional dialogue recording, which is where you're putting lines in, and all of you who watch TV shows or movies will notice if it feels like a line might be explaining something, and if it's not coming out of the person's mouth, it's possible that that line did not exist and it was only after. And there's some in this episode we can talk about. But in general, get it on screen, even if it feels unnecessary, because, you know, the saying we all talk about is, You write an episode of television 3 times, you write the script, you film it, and then you edit it. And all 3 of those are basically creative endeavors. And editing being in some ways the most fascinating because you can do the most. You can change the story in ways surprising and unexpected ways.
So let's talk about the editing, and the ADR was something I definitely wanted to pick up on. Going back to you were talking about the scene where where Addison Senior is talking about his wife not loving him, and I noticed I rewatched this earlier on this afternoon. And I noticed when Ben walks into the room, there's an off-screen line, which is always one of the dead giveaways, where he just says something like, "Sir, are you okay, sir?" And that's not in the script, and that felt to me like, actually, I thought, what would it be like if that wasn't in there? And that would probably be even more jarring, just to come back from a break and have Alexander saying that my wife doesn't love me.
My wife doesn't love me anymore.
Sir, we need you right now. You have to act. Sir.
My wife doesn't love me anymore.
So those are the kind of things that you're talking about, adding stuff in for...
Yeah, and you know...
tonal changes or explanations.
Because I don't know if it felt jarring to you when you read the script. You may have been like, oh, this actually doesn't feel as jarring as I thought, or may still have. Like, that's a perfect example of, like I said, like sometimes when you go for a sort of where you're going to leap ahead and have the audience play catch up. That's one of the riskier things to do as a storyteller on TV. Like, and oftentimes you come back and then you tee it up a little better. But so in the case of ADR on this episode, we edited, so the editor puts the footage together kind of to what the script is. Then the director will go through and edit it to the way that he or she thinks it should be, or they think it should be. And then Martin and I, as the showrunners, get to do whatever we want with it. But and Chris, because he's our partner the whole season, when I say producing director, what that means is actually Chris is on every episode of Quantum Leap, and his job on the episodes that he's not directing is to basically facilitate excellence from the other directors. So that does not mean stand over their shoulder and tell them what to do. That does mean say things like, you know, we've had good luck with these locations. Like, one of the things that's, you know, there are shows, we are not one of them, I'm happy to say, but there are shows where tensions between actors might require the producing director to let a guest director know, okay, like our 2 leads actually don't like one another, so you never can actually use them at the same time. Like, there are all these things producing directors sort of have to do. It's like another mini showrunner. But Chris, because he knows Martin and I sort of have a kind of style and aesthetic, he more or less just he gave us a director's cut, but he didn't do a lot on it because he knew we would want to do a lot on this one, because it had things like a submarine that we could not afford to film or even use stock footage of. One of the, satisfying things is that I don't think too many people watched it and felt like that the submarine wasn't present. Like, when you think about it in hindsight, you're like, oh, I never saw it. Like,
yeah, such an important piece, and it wasn't there. But yeah, it rattled along enough.
Exactly.
That you didn't know.
But then Martin and I edit it, and then the studio and the network see it, and then they give us feedback. And because it's the studio and the network, that's feedback you listen to, that's feedback you try to accomplish. And then often, because they're new viewers, they'll say, could you add a little piece here? Could you add a little piece there? So, for example, there's a moment where Addison says to Ben that it's hard to see her father like this because she's just wondering, why was he so cold to me? And, they were like, could you add growing up?
And I might see a side of him that I didn't see as a kid, but
But
why was he so cold to me growing up?
Now, I was like, I didn't necessarily think you needed it, but in hindsight, like people who just tuned in that week wouldn't necessarily know. So it's like, why was he so cold to me? And then the words growing up are ADR. Like, and there's little pockets of, most of the time it's clarity ADR.
There's a moment when they first start to suspect that the history as they know it isn't actually what happened. And I noticed another bit of ADR there, which again I didn't spot when I was first watching it. It was just when following along with the script, where Addison says, "But in the original timeline, this happened."
Come to 310, ahead full. Aye, sir.
In the original timeline, he ignored the transmission. Did we change something already?
Comms, let Fleet know we're disengaging from the war games.
And we know that. We were told that 5 minutes ago. Now, actually, when I was first watching, it didn't make me sit up and say, "Come on, we're not stupid here." So it obviously it was natural enough that it must have been needed. And I guess that's one of those clarity moments that you talk about, that without it, again, reading through the script, I did think, God, if this was the first time I was seeing this, I'd probably have forgotten because there's so much happening.
And that's one of the reasons why you listen to your partners. Like I would absolutely say, why are we repeating this information? But
yes.
if it didn't kick you out, then that's why I listened to them.
The fact that as a viewer paying attention, I didn't spot that it was repeating information until I was following the script. I thought, what? This wasn't here. Okay, I see why. So we talked about adding bits in, and you mentioned earlier about filming extra stuff, even if you're not sure whether you're going to use it or not, just because it's in the script. Can you talk about that reduction process then, and how you find pieces to cut, whether it's for time or for
sometimes
quality?
You never quite know how long an episode is going to come in. You think but sometimes, I remember "Oh Ye of Little Faith" was probably 52 minutes long, which when you have to get it down to 42 minutes, you're like, that's we've had a couple of episodes come in almost 10 minutes long. And when they come in that long, you actually just start looking at it and saying, what piece of the story can we lift? Like, what actual little thread of storyline? So, for example, from "Oh Ye of Little Faith," if my memory has this right, in "Oh Ye of Little Faith," there was a runner about the fact that the place where Addison and Ben were going to get married called because it was 6 months to the day. Like, the wedding was in 6 months and they hadn't received the deposit. Mm-hmm. And we had this whole thing about that. And if memory serves, we had to cut that for time. If I'm wrong, I apologize.
I don't remember any of that. So
that's the kind of thing.
Yeah.
And every now and then people will be like, I wish they had this in this episode. It's like, well, we did. But in the case of SOS, the biggest edit was, it's interesting because it was something, when I wrote it, I was really proud of it from a storytelling standpoint. And I should probably go back. So in the first draft, there was no Martinez.
Man, I'm totally confused.
This was not a Leaper X story because we, as a room, we weren't quite sure where we wanted. We knew we wanted Leaper X to appear a certain number of times before the end of the season. I'll just put it to you that way. And we knew, okay, we only have so many episodes, and we have several appearances that we want to do. But in the original draft, we hadn't decided where they would be. And so in the original draft, I was hung up on this idea that I didn't want what happened in the story to change Addison's father's destiny too much. Not just because I would be worried that you and everyone would get mad at me and be like, what, but it changed everything. But also because I don't want it to always be that life is so simple that you get to fix everything in a quantum leap. You know, I mean, you always fix the most important thing, but sometimes you don't fix everything. And so in the original script, which you read and filmed, after the rescue, there was a scene between the captain and Addison's father where Addison's father says, you know, we rescued them, and the captain acknowledges that he did, sort of just, and the idea there was just to see the captain as back to the human, where you're like, like he's not a monster, he's a human. And then we do the classic wrap-up, where Addison, you know, looks at the hand link and says, oh, the sailor's this, the sailor's that. And when she gets to her father, she's surprised to see that he still leaves the Navy, which seems at odds with what you just saw. And so Ben goes and talks to him, and there's a scene between the two of them where Ben says, you're leaving the Navy, basically. And Addison's dad explains that we punched out a guard, I ran through the ship, like, it may not have been an actual mutiny, but for all intents and purposes, like, it's functionally, like, that can't be okay. Like, I need to leave. I need to leave for the good of the service. And, you know, I sort of thought I was quite clever when, and by the way, I should say, not even me. Like, The Room, it had been one of our goals for the thing was, how do we have it be that at the end he still leaves the Navy? So we thought it was incredibly important, right? Then we decided to put Leaper X in. And because Leaper X, so then we decided to put Leaper X in, and I always let Martin write every Leaper X scene in terms of, like, when they're on screen talking, I just, like, I'm a big believer that for storylines that span a season, it's really good to have the same voice all the time. And so I knew Martin was going to do this scene between the two of them on the deck. And I'm so glad I did, because I would never have written, like, that's why I'm going to win. Like, it's good, confusing in all the best ways. I went back and created the Walker character in the radio room and then made him sort of noticeably colorful.
Walker.
What? It's an accurate way to keep time. Plus, I'm from Mississippi.
Colorful. With the idea being, hopefully you would be watching it, not knowing they might spoil it with promo photos, but hopefully you'd be watching it and at least remembering this Walker guy, and then being like, oh my God, that was Lee Breck's the whole time. Why am I telling you all this? Because so now you watch the finished film. They get through the mines. Yay! They save the sailors. Yay! We find out that the dad's still leaving the Navy. Then she goes and talks to her dad. And it had the effect of feeling like the episode kind of had more than one ending and sort of more than two endings. And Martin said, let's lift that out. And I remember thinking, and frankly, going back and forth in my head until it aired, thinking, like, should we have cut that? Like, have we inadvertently made a statement that, like, it's all, you can change whatever you want? But Martin's point, and I think he's right, because I think the takeaway was people did not, I think, walk away from it thinking too much that that's what we were saying. And so it seems to be that nobody missed it, thank goodness. But, that's an example of a piece where I would have told you, if you had said to me, well, Dean, you can't film that scene, I would have said to you, Matt, like, you don't understand. Like, the whole episode's like, this is so important to the episode. And then you watch it and you're like, oh, it's actually not that important to the episode. And that's part of the fun of editing. And then there were just a bunch of other pieces where Like we had just other pieces of Navy drama or little like extra, just little extra bells and whistles that feel additive when you read them. You're like, ooh, even more tension. But there's only so much you can experience when you're actually watching it as an audience, and you're like, okay, well, less is actually more here. Like, let's, we had in the opening drill, we had like a turn that was timed, and like there was more to the opening drill. When I watched the first cut, the opening drill, I was like, this is confusing.
How'd we do, Captain?
Good, but we can do better, especially with the Chinese watching.
Like what's going, like, so it's, you want to watch it with an open mind and not be too attached to what you thought it was going to be, so that you can feel like you can watch it for what it is. And I will say, one of the harder parts of the job is the first time you watch an episode, like most of the time you are mildly disappointed by what you see. And it's not that it isn't good, and it's not that the director hasn't done a good job. It's just, in your mind, you had honed the script to, let's say, I'll use a music analogy. The script was in tune. The script was all in tune. And then you watch a cut of your script, and it'll be like, and you're just like, oh my God. Like, there were 5 blahs in 45 minutes. Like, this is terrible. And then you remember, oh, I've been through this hundreds of times. Like, it's gonna turn out okay. And then and then once it's fascinating how much better something can play once you simply take out the things that aren't necessary or the things that are confusing. Like, the same scene can go from really being, I don't feel anything, to being really emotional. And I think that, that happened on several of our episodes. I think, like, where, at first blush we were like, oh, and then finished product, again, like I said, it's ultimately, the job is to make it that by the time you see it, you're happy with it. Once you finish filming, basically you have to edit it, you have to do the dialogue, you have to do the Foley. That's where people make sounds that happen on screen. And if you don't, it's fun to Google like Foley videos on YouTube, and you see like people like jumping around on like a pogo stick to make a sound on the screen. You have what's called loop group, which is where you have a collection of actors in a room with microphones, and like they do the restaurant talking, or they do in some cases they do the announcements. So like they're the person who's like, this is the drill. Like they do all of that. And then you get your music, you get your special effects, which you constantly are trying to make better. We have an incredible music department, and we have an incredible composer, and so who composes a score for every episode. And Quantum Leap, as we all know, is not the same show every week. So when his scores are added, which is right, by the way, a week or two before you see it, and you're sitting there at what's called the mix, which is where you're going to watch it on a big screen. All the sound effects have been put in. The ADR, that dialogue has been slipped in. Like, the ship is now going to sound like a ship instead of like, a sound stage. Like, sound makes a massive, massive difference. And music makes a massive, massive difference. If you ever wonder about that, go back and watch one of your favorite action movies and then just turn the sound off. Like, and it's really interesting to see, definitely Star Wars doesn't feel the same at the beginning without that opening John Williams. It really doesn't. So you put it all together and you see it at the mix roughly a week to 2 weeks before it goes on air. And that's when you know, okay, like, we survived another episode. And I always watch it on TV. I always watch them on TV, sometimes not always live, but I always watch them because as many times as you've seen it, it still looks different when you see it on TV, everything put together. And also things like you see the impact commercials have on your story. And that's something that it's important for people who are writing network TV to learn, because you learn to sort of remember, I'm going to have a commercial here, need to do a little reset there. Like, we need ADR here because like someone might have missed that moment and now they were gone for 3 minutes.
And like you said, there you survived another episode, one of 18 mini movies that you've been making back to back this season. So I guess from your point of view, then that's it. Move on to the next.
Yeah, I mean, we move on to the next while we're still doing this one. We're moving on to the next and the next, I think.
Right.
And some are, some require a ton of intervention and help. The truth is, I would probably say if you told me your 5 favorite episodes of the season, once the season's done, 50% of them would have been episodes that had all sorts of difficulty, all sorts of trouble. At times, seemed like they weren't going to work. And then the other half were like easy peasy. And then there's it's just, you never know until and you keep fighting to make it great until you run out of time.
Well, that almost sounds like a good deal to end on.
Sure.
We'll hopefully have you back in a few weeks. We'll tell you what our 5 favourite episodes were. And in the meantime, just thank you again for your time today, Dean. I've learnt a lot about production, and I've been studying TV production on an amateur level for years. So the fact that so much has come out in this last hour has been fantastic for me, and I'm sure for the listeners too.
My pleasure.
So
I guess,
thank you, and hopefully see you again very soon.
My pleasure. For those who want a deep dive on what it's like, that now they have it.